Hello, my amazing Algebra Half students. This is Mrs. A, and I love math. And today we are here with lesson 56 in our blue books, and we are talking about percent. Now we have a little vocabulary lesson here. In Latin, an ancient language, Latin, the word by, the word that means by, is per, and the word that means 100 is centum, where we get cent, right? And percent means by 100 or out of 100. So I like to say that percent means parts out of 100. If we were to take a pizza and we were to divide it into 100 pieces, wow, that would take a long time, and everybody that ate pizza would not get very much, right? But we would have to divide it in half, and then we would divide it in half again, and then we would have to take each one of these quarters and divide each one into 25 more pieces. Now, that's not a lot of pizza per person, is it? Okay, so 1/100th of anything is very small, okay, in proportion to the original amount. But 1/100th is one, if we had this quarter right here divided into 25 equal pieces, then one of those teeny weeny little slivers would be 1/100th of the pizza. Okay, because 4 times 25 is 100. So I'm not going to try to do that because I have a hard enough time just cutting a pizza up into 8 pieces, and even 16 pieces is really hard. Can you imagine cutting it up into 100 pieces? Wow. All right, so if I'm looking for 1% of a number, I'm looking for 1/100th of the number. So let's practice with this a little bit. So this is your first example here, and it says 1% of 7,500 is going to be the same thing as 7,500 divided by 100. Well, we know when we divide by 100, we can cancel zeros, and there's 2 zeros to cancel there. So we wind up with 75 over 1, which is 75. So 1% of 7,500 is 7,500 divided by 100, which is just 75. So if we know what 1% is equal to, then 3% of 7,500 is going to be 3 times whatever we got for the 1%. So 3 times 1% is 3%, and that 3 times 75 will be 225. So now, here we have another one. So we're still playing with 7,500. What is 34% of 7,500? I've got some glare going on my board here, don't I? So, when we're looking at this, 7,500, we already found 1%. 1% was 75. So 34%. Now this is the symbol. This little symbol right here is going to be our percent symbol. So instead of writing out 34%, I can write 34%. 34% of 7,500 is going to be 34% times 7,500. Anytime we see an of in a word problem, we will use times instead, okay? So now here we've got, again, 34% of 7,500 is 34/100ths times 7,500. And we already were able to cancel the 0, 0, and this one's on the denominator and that one's on the numerator, and we get our 75 times our 34, and 34 times 75 is 2,550. Okay, so we know that 1% of a number n is the same thing as 1 over 100. 1 part out of 100 is 1%. 1% of is always going to be times n. Or, when I multiply that out, don't I get, remember anytime I have times a number and I'm dealing with fractions, I can always put a 1 underneath the n. So n over 100 is the same thing as 1% of n. So when we want to put 1%, we can just 1 over 100 times a number. So that makes it easy. Okay, so now for this second example, okay, let's see if we can figure this out. 1% of 67. Okay, so 67 divided by 100. Isn't that 1%? Now, this is the fraction form of 1%. 67. So basically, it's 1 over 100 times 67. 1 over 100 times 67 gives us 67 over 100. Here is the fraction form of 1% because nothing cancels. What about the decimal form of 1%? Could we use both? Could we use dividing by 100 is moving the decimal place 2 places to the left? So if I have 67 and I take this decimal point and I move it 2 places to the left, I get 0.67. And 0.67 means exactly the same amount as 67 over 100. So we'll be practicing that later too. So if 1% is 67, of 67 is 0.67, then 140%, wouldn't it just be 140 times 0.67? Okay, because the 140 over 100 was already taken care of here. So we already had 1% figured out. So 140% is just going to be 140 times 1%. Okay, so this is very easy when we're thinking about 100. So if I said, what is 34% of 100, then that would be 34 over 100 times 100. And I would get 34. Okay, now this one is our first practice problem. So I want you to copy this down and then pause your video. Okay, what is 1% of 64? Well, let's do it 2 ways. Let's think of the actual words and let's write it out in a little sort of formula. 1% is 1 out of 100. Of means times 64. Okay, so 64 times 1 is, we can put a 1 there, is 64 out of 100. That's all we have to do. Okay, so that gives us a fraction form of 1%, but we usually will simplify our fractions. Could we say that this is 32 out of 50, or even 16 out of 25? Okay, so what did I do? I took my 64 out of 100, I divided by 2 and divided by 2 and got 32 out of 50. I divided by 2 and divided by 2 and got 16 out of 25. So now 1% is 16 out of 25. So what is 40% of 64? Well, since I already found out what 1% is, I know that 40% is going to be 40 times the 1%, which is 16 over 25. Okay, and that's going to end up being, now we can simplify a little bit. We know that 5 goes into both of those. So 5 goes into 40 8 times, and 5 goes into 25 5 times. And then we end up with nothing else canceling. We're going to have 16 times 8 is, let's see, we got a 48, carry the 4, 128 over 5. Okay, so that would be one way to write the answer, or we could turn that into a decimal. Okay, so that is the first example. Or we could start this one from scratch, and we could say, okay, 40% is 40 over 100 times 64. And notice the 64 over 100 is still in there, isn't it? So 64 over 100 times 40, any way you cut it, you're going to get the same answer. Okay, so percents are a lot of fun and very easy to work with because dividing by 100 is pretty easy, especially when you're using decimals. And this is our last practice, so copy it down and then pause your video. Okay, so on the first one, what is 1% of 5? So let's start using the fraction method. 1% is 1 over 100. Of means times, and 5 can be written as 5 over 1. So when I multiply across, I get 5 over 100, which is equal to 1 over, when we divide by 5 and divide by 5, we get 1 over 20. So 1/20th is 5%. But what if I didn't want fractions? What if I wanted a decimal equivalent? Couldn't I just take 5, and since I'm dividing by 100, my decimal is here, I move the decimal 2 places to the left, and 0.05 is the same thing as 1 over 20. Okay, so let's do this one 2 ways. So first, what is 35% of 5? Well, we already found out what 1% of 5 is. 1% of 5 is 1 over 20. And so 35% of 5 is going to be 35 times 1 over 20. So 35 over 1 times 1 over 20 is 35 over 20, but we could simplify because the top divides by 5, leaving 7, and the bottom divides by 5, leaving 4. So we have a fraction answer of 7/4, and that is 35% of 5. If we wanted to, we could put that into a mixed number, and 7 divided by 4 goes one time with 3/4 left over. Okay, so depending on how they want us to express it, we could write it as an improper fraction or as a mixed number or even as a decimal. So the second way we're going to do this problem is just like from scratch. Instead of taking the 5% that we had already figured out, let's start over at the beginning. But this time, since we used fractions last time, this time let's use decimals. Okay, now we're going to do the same problem, but we're going to use decimals instead of fractions. So 35% is 35 over 100, and when we divide by 100, we move the decimal place 2 places to the left. So even though you don't see a decimal place in 35, the decimal place is at the end of the number, and we move it 2 places to the left. So now it is 0.35. So this is 1%, or this is 35%, excuse me. And then 35% of means times 5. So now I'm going to take 0.35 times 5. So 0.35 times 5, and 5 times 5 is 25. Carry the 2. 15 plus 2 is 175, 2 decimal places, or 1.75. Well, 1.75 is the same thing in decimal form as 1 3/4 is in fractions. So the first time we did it in fractions and got 1 3/4. The next time we did it in decimals and got 1.75. But 0.75 is the same as 3/4. Do you believe me? If I take 3 and divide by 4, which is what 3/4 is, I end up with 0.75 when I do my division. And we are done with this lesson, but we are by no means done with percents, because you will see percents for a long, long, long time, all the way through algebra and even into calculus. You will work with percents because percents are everywhere. And then you can say, I will have a percent for your thoughts. Have you ever heard of I have a penny for your thoughts? Well, I will have 1% of $1 for your thoughts. And it's 1% of $1 is a penny. And this is Mrs. A. And may God bless your day.